Female CEOs, we know, are a pretty rare breed. They make up about 5 to 6% of the S&P 500 or Fortune 500 companies. Female CEOs in the financial services industry are like unicorns. I mean, impossible to find. Fatima mentioned the one lone female CEO of a bank, Jane Fraser. We see that asset management firms, there seems to be a little bit more female representation. You've got Abigail Johnson at Fidelity, Jenny Johnson at Franklin Templeton. You are at New York Life Investment Management. Why do you think this is?
You know, I think it just reflects the evolution of the finance industry over time. You know, we're at a point now where I think there's been so much focus on improving the diversity of those coming into the industry, but it takes a while for that class to make it to a level where they can be in senior positions. And I'm encouraged by what I see in terms of the increasingly diverse, increasingly female population. But what's important for all of us is to make sure that those individuals and that representation continue as they move up. And having been CEO now for a few years, I have a couple of thoughts on this in terms of how we can ensure that happens. I think number one, when you think about women, they oftentimes are a little bit less noisy when it comes to what is their next career step.
Less self-promotional.
Exactly. And it's easy to assume that they're comfortable with the role that they're in, that they're not as ambitious as the men, but that's not a safe assumption. Secondly, women tend to want to satisfy every single criteria for that next position. Right? We know through research men don't necessarily hold themselves to that. And so we have to. If they're not willing to raise their hand, we raise their hand for them. And then lastly, I think this is where research also shows that women don't oftentimes realize just how important sponsors are for them in order to get that next opportunity. And so as a result, women, and especially women of color, get further behind in their career relative to men.
So you mentioned that you've held the top job at New York Life for almost 7 years now, since 2015. You've been with the firm for 11 years. During that time, you oversaw a fourfold increase in assets under management. Being CEO is not a job that someone stumbles into. You've done incredibly well. At what point in your 36-year career in finance did you realize that you were kind of laying the groundwork for becoming a CEO?
You know, it's interesting, Scarlet, I really didn't think about becoming a CEO.
You stumbled into it?
I sort of stumbled into it. You know, and I think you have to take a step back with me. You know, I'm the product of immigrant parents, and I have a lot of that spirit within me, in the sense of feeling like it was up to me to sort of figure things out along the way. I should be the one that adjusts and adapt and fit in. Mm-hmm. And so once I ended up in finance, I really didn't have the benefit of a lot of people around me to advise me. So more or less I would look around and I'd see different people, a couple steps ahead of me, and I'd say, okay, that's interesting. And that's what happened in business school. My next door neighbor was this very accomplished analyst from a Wall Street bank, and I thought she held herself up so well. I wanted to be that, and that's what led me into investment.
So you modeled yourself after people that you thought, you know, I'd like to see what they've got going on. I want to try this out.
Exactly.
So you did not exactly plot out a career in finance. So you studied engineering. What kind?
Mechanical.
Mechanical, and then you ended up working in finance. How did you make that transition, aside from the math skills, which probably makes finance look easy compared to engineering?
Yeah, it's true. So I guess I was fortunate because I ended up having a number of internships as an engineer, and I kept wondering more about what the companies were all about, their strategy, their approach, rather than the products that I was building. And so when I had the chance to really go to business school and embark on that road, I just said, I might as well just go do that. And what has been helpful for me, I think, is the analytical skills that I developed. And, it's a business, it's constantly changing, so it's important to be curious and really enjoy learning. And all of those pieces, the sort of problem solving that I so enjoy, really has benefited me.
So your first job in finance was at Dean Witter, which was, of course, later taken over by Morgan Stanley. You started in investment banking, focusing on real estate and like really complicated legal transactions, doing the math on it, using your hardcore engineering math skills. That was fairly easy in finance. You stayed with it even after Morgan Stanley bought out Dean Witter in investment banking. But at what point did you realize, you know what, there's more to finance than just investment banking, making pitch books?
You know, I ended up at doing real estate investment banking, as you said, and I really did enjoy it. But there came a point in time where, even it's today, right? Tech is really taking over bricks and mortar. And so I found myself in a group that just didn't have the revenue volume. I was looking for that next promotion, and it was really hard to come by. And I was very fortunate because I had a boss that I'd known for a long time, and not only did he sit me down and say, chances aren't great here, but I'll also help you find another opportunity. And that led me into this role that was intersection between business and technology. It was a tough decision because I remember for the first 6 months, I didn't understand anything anybody was saying. And then I woke up one day and I sort of got it. But it set me on this path where almost every 2 to 3 years, I had a different position, different role, different company. And I learned to put myself and get comfortable with being outside my comfort zone.
Was that deliberate, by the way, the every 2 years cadence?
It was not, really. I think, again, it's a little bit of a theme, you know, in terms of seeing where the opportunities might be, how can I round out my skill set. And so sometimes I was asked, other times I felt like I had to do this next opportunity. But in hindsight, I think to your point, it was the best training possible for becoming CEO.
Yeah, to expose you to all different parts of the bank. You mentioned that you're in real estate and you wanted to move into technology, which is more revenue generating. It's you know, clearly the hot area. Why is it that women seem to be in finance more ensconced in things like retail and utilities and less of the exciting high growth areas like technology?
I think there's a lot of aspects of finance that can be intimidating. And I think we all have an opportunity to change that profile. When I think about what we do in investment management, it has a lot of purpose, a lot of good, helping people achieve their financial aspirations. And so I think there is a tendency to shy away from that, even though women are as capable, right, in these areas as men. And I think that's really what happens over the course of time. But again, I think it's important, if I reflect on my own career, it has been those opportunities that have just been, you know, a little bit off the main beaten path. And I've learned and built confidence over time that regardless of the situation, I'll figure it out.
So then you pivoted to investment management, and that was not deliberate either. You kind of went into it as a chief of staff to someone who was in the business. Is that right? Can you explain how that transpired?
Sure. So again, I think I ended up in this intersection of business, banking, and technology, and it had sort of run its course. And so I needed to figure out my next move. And fortunately, the gentleman that was running the asset management business was somebody that was previously my boss's boss's boss, and I must have left somewhat of a good impression because when I came knocking on his door, he needed a chief of staff. And everything worked out. At the time, it was a little bit of a step back in terms of pay and the like, but it was, again, in hindsight, it was such a good move. And it shows, I think, the value of relationships, you know, to my point earlier of making sure you have a strong community and then taking a chance.
So that's really interesting that at the time it was a little bit of a step back. Did that give you pause? Like, I have to keep moving forward. I can't afford to take a step back because that might set me off on a different trajectory.
I ended up really thinking about this from the standpoint, once I left banking, which was a very well-established path, I found as I kept making these moves that I learned more and more about myself, what I enjoyed, what I was good at, what I didn't like. And so I viewed that opportunity as just another way to see, is this an industry I like? You know, is there more that I want to do? And again, I am so grateful that I had that because that's led me to where I am today.
And then in the middle of the subprime crisis, before the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, you went over to Bridgewater, which is the asset management firm that's run by Ray Dalio. You focused on acquisitions there?
I did not. I actually focused on just general management and focusing around bringing on talent into the organization.
Okay, so you're steeped in that culture, principles, all of that. You made a transition to New York Life. Were you looking for this specific opportunity to go into an investment management company in a life insurance company, or did it kind of land in your lap? Were you deliberately looking for this kind of firm?
I was looking for an opportunity to have impact in terms of the skills that I had acquired over time to really build a business. And I was introduced to New York Life through a family friend, and at the time, they were really focused on growing this business. And I saw all the perfect ingredients for growing it. Here you have a long-standing institution that's been around 175 years, essentially private, enormous amount of capital, long-term perspective, and a great environment, and set of values and culture that really align with mine. So,
what was it about the values and culture that
I really
captured your attention?
appreciated.
Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, I think it is a company that's very focused on being there for their clients whenever they need them and having this long-term perspective. It's a culture that I would describe as a we place, not a me place, which very much fits with who I am. And I also saw a real sincerity in terms of commitment to diversity and creating opportunities. And I think I'm such a prime example of that. And so all of those elements I found really attractive.
So as Asian women, we confront issues of race and gender. There's also issues of age. And I'm curious because I know early in my career I looked young, and there was a lot of conversations with my managers where it's like, oh, you're too young to be taken seriously, or why would you want that? You can wait a few years. Did you experience that as well? And if so, how did you navigate that?
I can completely relate. I think I told you I couldn't wait to have wrinkles and gray hair.
That's a first.
Is that crazy? You know, so people would take me seriously. You know, it again comes from that mindset of, look, you know, if it takes me a little bit longer or if I have to wait a little more, so be it. You know, at least I'm in the game. Mm-hmm. And I think that patience and that sort of willingness to sort of just bite it out, I think has paid off.
Right, and we talked about this earlier about how also as an Asian, there's this culture of respecting your elders, of making space for them, listening to them, heeding and almost not submitting to their requests, but giving them the space and the priority. Did that hold you back at all in any way as you continued to rise in your career? Did you have to change your thinking on that?
I did. I think as you're referring to, it's sort of speak when you're spoken to.
Yes.
Right. You know, let those with more experience take the floor first. That was something that was a real hard transition for me, where I just had to force myself to speak up and just forget about how perfect that was and just keep doing it over and over again. And even today, you know, I think about this dinner I attended last week with a number of very prominent CEOs, and I found myself really reticent to say something unless I was asked a question. And I realized some of this is ingrained, but the more that you're aware of those, the more that you can sort of force yourself to go beyond it.
Yeah, and especially when you're in a group that isn't women, isn't Asians, or isn't in your industry, you're kind of out of your comfort zone, right? How often do you have to remind yourself of these things, even as a CEO of a massive investment management company?
A little bit less today than when I was younger, but it's still there. And I view myself still as a work in progress, as I'm sure all of us do. And I think that's a really important mindset, because then you don't hold yourself to, I have to be perfect at this. Because the more we do it, the better we get at it.
So there's this book called Undiversified, I should say, by Katrina Dudley and Ellen Carr, which really explores the issues on why there's gender imbalance in the investment management industry. And you've come out of this as well. And they identify all kinds of issues with the pipeline, with risk-taking, which is reflected in the pay structure, where sometimes often women are more comfortable with a flat pay than commission pay. The importance of networking. Let's talk about networking here. You mentioned mentors, and I think in all the instances, they were men as well. Did you seek out male mentors? Were there female mentors available to you if you wanted one?
Less so, I would say. I mean, there were a few women along the way that I really valued, you know, in terms of people I looked up to. But by virtue of when I entered the industry, it was mostly dominated by men. But they were very helpful to me. And it started with my dad, who was just an incredible supporter of mine, thought that I could do whatever I wanted to put my mind to. And then to the manager that I mentioned when I was running up against the promotion wall, him having not only just leveling with me, but also opening a door for me. And I even remember earlier than that, he used to say to people, anytime I have a really tough problem, I bring it to Yie-Hsin. And I think back about that too, because people in positions of power and influence, we need them to help lend some of that to all of us, to give us the opportunity, the credibility, the chance to have that next step. And that's really what I think about when I think about sponsors. And it has to be a two-way street also. I think one of the things I realized sort of midway in my career is focusing on what they're trying to accomplish. And if I can help them accomplish that, and I do that multiple times over, it does ultimately pay back.
Well, now that you're CEO, how do you create an environment where there can be male sponsors for younger women? And I bring this up because after Me Too, there are a lot of stories about how senior male executives were reluctant to mentor a younger woman because they didn't want to be in a position where there could be misinterpretation of any kind. And so they felt it was just safer not to mentor a younger woman. How do you create the space for that? How do you lead the company to a place where it's okay to do that and everyone feels comfortable with it?
I think we have to recognize these last 2 years have been one of incredible amount of change, right? This global pandemic, a racial reckoning, this terrible crisis that we're seeing unfold in Ukraine. This is a time where leadership has to show up differently in the sense of being much more empathetic, much more inclusive, and meeting people where they are. And I say that because as much as perhaps men might feel uncomfortable, I think all of us feel uncomfortable. We need to be having these conversations. At New York Life 5-6 years ago, we commissioned a study to better understand racial relations in the workplace. And one of the greatest insights we found is that for all of us in this room and across this country, typically our most diverse workplaces is in the office. It used to be race was there with politics and religion, but we have to bring it in because given the emotional nature of everything we've been through, we cannot ask people to park their emotions at the front door before they come in. So it's a long-winded answer, but I would say that we have to really lean on our colleagues in talent management and HR. They're wonderful unconscious bias programs. We've had candid conversations about race, creating space for that. And recognizing that if a one-on-one situation doesn't feel comfortable, there's no reason why you can't have a group conversation, but these are conversations that need to happen if we're going to make progress in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and you could do it in a public place perhaps where doors are not closed and people can see you. Fatima just mentioned earlier about D&I needing to take a center stage and being right there in front, not off to the side. Your chief diversity officer is also the head of talent management. That was very intentional, wasn't it?
Yes.
So how does that person fold in diversity into how they seek out talent? Because we were talking earlier, and the average tenure of someone at New York Life is how long?
Like 15
years. So the average person you meet at this firm stays there for 15, 20 years. If you're there for 3 years, you're considered a newbie. So how do they fold that in to make sure that you're finding the right people, the people who want to build this company together?
Well, I think that move really comes almost 15, 20 years after we established a chief diversity officer role at New York Life. And I think what we've come to realize is that this takes hard work. And you have to embed a DEI lens into every process you have around talent. So that's from talent acquisition, having a diverse slate of candidates, a diverse slate of interviewers. It's to development and thinking about what kinds of programs really make sense for people depending on where they start and what needs they have, to the promotion process and thinking many years in advance about what are the kinds of opportunities, development opportunities they need to be in a position so that when they're up for promotion, there's no debate as to whether they should get it or not. And I think that was our realization, is that you can't just think about DEI on the side. It needs to be embedded in everything around your people.
And you set the tone. Yie-Hsin, thank you so much for joining us. Yie-Hsin Hung is CEO of New York Life Investment Management.